Justice Punchchi Commission on Center-State Relations, 2010 Report, Volume 7, Socio-Economic Development, Public Policy and Good Governance. Summary of conclusions and recommendations. 1. Introduction. Recommendation 1. This final volume of the report is of primary concern to the citizens and the governments alike, as it suggests a roadmap for good governance in the country within the federal framework of the Constitution, empowering the citizen, decentralizing the administration, taking the directive principles more seriously, and increasing the space for private participation in governance are the key principles emphasized in this roadmap. Inclusiveness and equity in approach, transparency and consultativeness in style are twin strategies which seem to deliver results in the long run. The challenge is to bring about such an administrative culture at all three levels of government. No doubt, the situation is getting complicated by large-scale migration of population, political mobilization around sectarian and regional interests, widespread militancy and violence by terrorist groups, and pervasive corruption in public life. The positive element in this otherwise depressing scenario is a steady growth in the economy, deep penetration of human rights and rule of law in the popular culture, and an abiding faith in democracy and pluralism among all sections of people. These are strong foundations of constitutionalism which keeps the country united on the path of democracy and development. A few changes, as suggested here in the style of governance, will hopefully bring about the desired directional reforms to keep the momentum towards the evolution of a just social order that the Indian Constitution envisages. 3. This chapter, therefore, has reproduced the various recommendations in previous chapters with a view to focus attention of the central and state governments on their respective roles and responsibilities in a federal framework towards promoting socio-economic development, public policy, and good governance. 2. Policy making to be more inclusive and consultative. 1. In a large, complex, and diverse country like India, policy making on major issues affecting the lives and livelihoods of people to be acceptable and practical need to be not just consultative but perceived to be so. It's therefore recommended that in sector specific subjects, mechanisms like public hearings may be statutorily employed involving panchayats and municipalities. This should be done through holding of mandatory consultation, wherein the governments, both at the center and the states, should clearly respond to the views expressed and concerns raised at these public hearings before finalizing the policies for adoption. The Commission also recommends that the policies themselves should clearly identify the different categories of stakeholders who would be affected in one way or the other by the policy. Further, the policies should contain clear guidelines on implementation and monitoring with reference to identified parameters and milestones. 2. The Commission emphasizes the need to have flexibility in the policies with the object of catering to the diversity. The Commission strongly suggests stopping the one policy fit all approach. 3. As a corollary to the above approach, the Commission also recommends constitutional empowerment of the people to petition the appropriate government for making or amending policies whenever needed. Today, this is happening through the intervention of the court in public interest petitions. Article 350 does envisage such a procedure for redressal of grievance in respect of delivery of public services. This approach would have a twofold purpose. First, would help to preserve the separation of powers, and second, would enable the policies to be citizen-centric. 3. Need to improve vigilance systems in public administration 1. Civil society involvement in public policy and administration is the best strategy for good governance. What is important, therefore, is to maximize opportunities, therefore, while making policies and programs. In this regard, the Commission recommends, inter alia, the following steps. A. Let good governance be introduced as a directive principle of state policy. B. To increase the efficiency from civil servants, the rules of recruitment, remuneration, and career progression need to be completely revamped on the lines recommended by the Second Administrative Reforms Commission 2008. The civil servants need also to be insulated from political pressures to be able to perform their functions objectively and fairly. C. The citizens' right to have a corruption free government be acknowledged as part of administrative law. D. There is a need for the All India services to be politically neutral and professionally independent. Vigilance structures and Lok Ayuks need to be strengthened to constantly monitor and improve the quality of public service. E. It will be desirable to disseminate the achievements and good practices of better performing states through publicity campaigns and conferences to make citizens realize what their fellow citizens in some other states have been able to achieve with same or less resources. F. All service providers, government or private, be asked to prepare and publish the entitlements of citizens in relevant sectors through citizens' charters. G. Social audit of the major policy initiatives of government at periodic intervals be made a mandatory practice and reports be placed on the table of the legislature every 2 years with comments from appropriate governments. 4. Need to develop a positive approach to sectarian mobilization. 1. Given the multiple identities and diversities of people, it's natural to expect political mobilization around sectarian and regional interests, sometimes appearing to jeopardize national purpose. There is a need to take a balanced and mature approach towards such developments, particularly by parties ruling the central government. 2. The Indian Constitution allows flexibility to accommodate regional identities and sectarian and even separatist movements as long as they abide by the constitutional parameters. Unity in diversity is a beautiful concept, difficult to practice in a federal arrangement. Nevertheless, the experience of 60 years of the Republic is proof of strong foundations and sound understanding of the idea that is India. 3. Thus, the Commission is of the view that movements within states that demand additional accommodation for regional identities, while otherwise desiring to remain within the fold of the Constitution, ought to be treated with respect and consideration even in situations where the central government might not entirely share the sentiments and perceptions of that movement. This issue is discussed in detail in Internal Security Volume 5 of the report. 8. 5. Coalition politics is a game to be played within the constitutional framework. 1. Coalition politics need not be inherently problematic as long as the parties follow the rules of the game and respect the authority of the law and the Constitution. It may slow down the pace of development occasionally, but the practice of evolving the Dharma of Common Minimum Program did help to overcome difficulties while controlling the excesses of the dominant coalition partners. Coalition government can be looked at as a sign of genuine accountability of the uniquely Indian polity and its system of governance. Two, what is important is to ensure that the constitutional status of state governments is given due recognition by the central government while taking decisions, particularly in relation to local governments. The culture of shared governance is to be carefully nurtured if good governance is to be offered to the people. 6. On local self government and center state relations. 1. The Commission is of the view that the central government should be cautious about bypassing the machinery of states while allocating funds to the local bodies, primarily for two reasons. First, keeping states out of the process leads to an anomalous situation where the entity with the constitutional powers with regard to certain facets of social and economic policy are deprived of the power to function effectively. Second, it may so happen that the central government allocates funds for a certain period of time, but is afterwards unable or unwilling to continue disbursing funds, thereby resulting in languishing of certain welfare programs with grave consequences for general public interest. 2. In view of the center's generally more robust financial position, it's inevitable and desirable that it would be allocating funds for the purpose of economic and social development in the states. However, the Commission is of the view that such funds should invariably be allocated through the machinery of the state governments. 7. Social justice is the signature tune of the Indian Constitution. 1. Improving the lot of the poorest of the poor and providing equal opportunities for all is to be the priority of all levels of government, for which the Constitution has provided the agenda in parts 3 and 4, consisting of fundamental rights and directive principles of state policy, respectively. It's a general impression that successive governments, both at the center and in the states, have not been successful in the implementation of the directives which form the core obligations of the state vis a vis social justice and welfare. It's time to recognize it as the joint and separate responsibility of all three levels of government and demand time bound implementation of the obligations thereunder. Let the state and central governments acknowledge the obligations and introduce it in annual budget statements. 8. Need for assessment of state performance in respect of directive principles. 1. There has not been any independent assessment of the performance of state and central governments in respect of implementation of directive principles which are fundamental for governance. The existing system of plan implementation assessment reports do not fully take care of implementation of directive principles of state policy. The human development reports being brought out by some states tend to give an incomplete picture of the situation, and the UNDP report on the subject is equally not reflective of the total picture. As such, government should itself develop acceptable parameters to measure progress on education, health, housing, nutrition, and related matters, particularly in states where the situation continued to be of concern for long periods. Media reports are often alarming and sometimes misleading. In these circumstances, objective and authoritative collection and dissemination of information on performance in relation to control of extreme poverty is imperative. Need for responsive and responsible governance. It's also part of the obligation under the Millennium Development Goals of the United Nations, to which India is a signatory. 9. Directive principles may be reviewed and enriched periodically. 1. Given the growth of knowledge and technology in recent times, it has become necessary to review the directive principles of state policy for its further development. New responsibilities need to be undertaken by the state. Climate change is an illustrative example in this context. The Commission would recommend review and revision of the principles contained in Part 4 of the Constitution to keep with the changing times. 10. Shared responsibility and state accountability. 1. It's a vexed issue to fix responsibility when powers and functions are shared among different levels of government. Based on the practice and federal systems, commentators have identified different models of governance depending upon the nature and scope of shared responsibilities and decision making powers. They are often described as a unilateral federalism in which the federal government directs provincial policy, usually through conditional funding. B. Collaborative federalism, in which both governments work collaboratively to attain policy goals and is characterized by the absence of coercion from the federal government. And C. Cooperative federalism, where roles and responsibilities of different tiers of government are well defined, which necessitates cooperation from all levels of government. India needs to move towards collaborative federalism model. 2. If one were to categorize the institutional design under the recently adopted Right of Children to Free and Compulsory Education Act 2009, it tends to be a model of cooperative federalism where the central government sets policies and standards and extends technical and financial assistance. The state and local governments are to implement the provisions for which the legislation defines the roles and responsibilities. The institutional design envisages cooperation, though it is not directed by the center under threat of sanctions. The Commission is inclined to endorse the model for implementation of directive principles, which largely contain subjects in the state's domain under the 7th schedule. 3. Regarding steps towards the attainment of universal elementary education, it's the view of the Commission that the suggestions of the states and political parties regarding having an universal accreditation system and standard setting body with participation from the center, state, and private bodies be favorably considered, as the same would go a long way in laying down the national indicators and performance standards. Further, the Commission recommends the Union government to consider the United States experience and examine whether something like a charter option will be an appropriate mechanism to adopt for effective implementation of the right of every child to free and compulsory education under the Act of 2008. 4. By increasing the participation of civil society and non government organizations in the implementation process and by providing for social audit of welfare legislation, the Commission believes that state accountability can be ensured. The framework employed in the National Rural Employment Guarantee Act in this regard is to be particularly commended and deserves to be emulated in social welfare programs. The Commission would recommend a central legislation incorporating minimum standards in the conduct of social audit processes so that the delivery system of public services may be further strengthened while administration is democratized to the advantage of the public. 5. In this regard, the policy of the NREGA guidelines regarding incorporating provisions relating to transparency, participation, consultation and consent, accountability and redressal, while drafting such a central social audit legislation, in particular, may be noted. Finally, it would be worthwhile to study the positive experience of Andhra Pradesh in conducting social audit in NREGA in understanding the means of making the government the facilitator and the people vigilant in undertaking the social audit process. 11. Public private partnerships for better delivery of services. 1. In the delivery of public services, private sector participation may help in introducing innovative ideas, generating additional financial resources, and introducing corporate management practices for improving efficiency and accountability to users. 2. In this regard, the Commission would also like to point out that the entire criticism on PPPs is based upon a misunderstanding of the very term. The Commission would like to reiterate the definition of PPP and distinguish it from privatization. The Planning Commission defines PPP to be involving private management of public service through a long term contract between an operator and a public authority, whereas privatization involves outright transfer of a public service or facility to the private sector. 3. However, to ensure democratic accountability, the regulatory mechanisms in PPP projects has to be properly structured and organized based on fair contractual terms. Special interest groups should not have opportunity to capture the regulatory system. The People's Campaign for Decentralized Planning, introduced in Kerala some time ago, is an interesting example of how self governing institutions involving people can help delivery of public services better. 4. In the context of ensuring the application of the principles of good governance and directive principles of state policy to the private players, introducing the discipline of human rights into the working of the non state organization and making the entities democratically accountable, the Commission endorses the view of the states in this regard. The Commission thus believes that the following suggestions received from the states may be looked into favorably. 1. Drafting a national policy for creating a mechanism whereby the private players can actively participate in formulation of policies and implementation and monitoring or supervision of projects or programs. This will ensure utilization of their financial resources, engagement of their human resource experience, and their improved involvement in government policies, projects, programs. Further, this will also enable the building of harmonious public private partnership. 2. The Memorandum of Understanding between the private entity and the government should contain specific clauses after due negotiations that provide for adequate checks and balances to ensure that the entity operates within the framework of the rule of law, spelling out its obligations and duties towards the citizens as also the extent of its liability for breach of duty. In this regard, the extent of obligation of the government authority may also be provided, and the antecedents of the entity should be duly incorporated. 3. Drafting of a national legislation that provides for the penalties to be levied against the private entities for breach of their duties and for other defaults made in this regard. 4. Holding a social audit by the citizens on such PPPs on the same lines as recommended by the Commission for the creation of a central social audit legislation according to the guidelines of the NREGA. In this regard, the Commission recommends that the regulatory agency should incorporate processes and systems whereby the stakeholders would have access to information, would be able to make representations, and have full participatory and process rights. In this regard, the Commission recommends that the provisions of the Administrative Procedure Act 1946 APA to public participation in the contracting out process could be executed to the regulatory regime to set up in India. 5. Amending the definition of state under Article 12 of the Constitution to the extent of making the private entities constitutionally liable under the directive principles of state policy to the citizens of India with respect to the performance under the PPPs. 6. Structuring a regulatory mechanism consisting of an independent regulator who would have the authority to oversee all the state regulatory agencies set up in various states for the public delivery of social services in different areas such as education, health, water, employment, etc. Further, the building of a self regulating system through a partnership between state and non state actors subject to periodic monitoring and evaluation in terms of certain process and outcome indicators relating to the regulatory mechanism. The Commission is also of the view that if the regulatory agency is allowed to participate through comments on the proposed contractual terms, then the mode of enforcement of contract and their monitoring will be much easier. 7. Setting a system of accreditation for ensuring the credibility of such non state organization. 8. The Commission also recommends the strengthening of the Panchayat Raj institutions so that there can be effective coordination and consultation between the panchayats and the private players while designing, implementing, and monitoring the PPPs at the grassroots level. 12. Public Policy Dispute Resolution Mechanism System. 1. In India, in the context of policy making, while this Commission suggests consultation before the making of a public policy, at the same time, the Commission also recommends providing a public policy dispute resolution mechanism. The Commission is of the view that the collaborative governance model would be an innovative way of ensuring that public policy dispute resolutions are carried on with the inclusive participation of the citizenry, thereby enhancing the democratic process. Fiscal transfers under centrally sponsored schemes are problematic. 1. It is the perception of states to which the Commission is by and large in agreement that CSS has tended to erode state powers and resulted in skewed fiscal relations between the center and the states. While appreciating the good intentions and importance of CSS in selected areas, it is desired that the states should have control on the design and execution of the schemes. States' priorities and local initiatives are more often ignored in specific purpose transfers ordinarily made under rigid guidelines. The states complain that their financial burdens under CSS are sometimes unilaterally increased. The conditionalities tend to encroach legislative autonomy of states, more so when transfers are made to local bodies and parastatals. 2. The need is not to sacrifice CSS but to devise a system under which the federal balance is strictly maintained and accountability established. Some of the schemes can be totally transferred to states. In others, enough flexibility be built in to let the states control the design and implementation. Periodic review jointly by the center and the states will ensure the coordination and the direction necessary to achieve the national purpose, while correcting inefficiencies, leakages, and corruption. The mere fact that the center is in a position to provide a greater share of funds for projects pertaining to social and economic development ought not to give it a right to dictate terms to states on matters that otherwise fall within the constitutional domain of the states. 14. Need to provide more untied funds. 1. Funds earmarked for states as far as possible should not be tied to rigid conditionalities prejudicial to good center state relations. In setting performance targets, some flexibility has to be provided to accommodate location specific problems and challenges. In the circumstances, the Commission is of the view that the Center should bestow greater authority and trust on states in centrally sponsored schemes and allow the democratic and constitutional processes to ensure greater accountability on money spent in the name of development. 15. Migrants versus locals threatening social harmony and development. 1. An emerging challenge to constitutional governance and national integrity is the situation arising out of large scale migration of people from one state to another, often in search of better economic opportunities. Some political parties tend to create disaffection between the locals and migrants with a view to consolidate vote banks, resulting in piquant situations of law and order and social harmony. The fundamental rights to free movement is sometimes threatened. It's a challenge to the state and central governments and requires careful handling by the governments concerned. The Center has a duty to evolve guidelines in consultation with states to deal with crisis situations and get support of all political parties to follow the norms. Extreme disparities in the quality of life and continued backwardness of certain regions are responsible for migration, which calls for a review of development policies and administrative arrangements. Penalizing the migrant population will be counterproductive. 16. Governance has to be responsive to needs of human development. 1. Equity and inclusiveness is fundamental to unity and development in multicultural societies. This is a function of decentralized governance and social justice, which is part of the constitutional scheme. The bureaucracy and the political leadership will have to change their traditional mindsets and develop responsiveness at all levels of the administration. The recommendations of the Second Administrative Reforms Commission 2009 in this regard require the central government's consideration on a priority basis. People's participation is inevitable in inclusive governance, and the bureaucracy has to learn new ways of working with the people. Institutionalizing participatory planning from the grassroots level upwards is a key factor in strengthening democratic governance and inclusive development, particularly in a market oriented economy. In this regard, the Commission is of the view that district planning committees and the Panchayati Raj institutions, as mandated by the Constitution for effective grassroots participation, must be strengthened. 2. There is need for ensuring convergence of centrally funded institutions in the northeastern region so that the northeastern states can tap the knowledge and resources that each of these institutions has created or is in the process of creating. This would also bring in a measure of accountability in these institutions, which hitherto have been functioning as independent entities. 3. The primacy of improving the human development indices, health, education, and communication for achieving good governance needs no emphasis. In the area of health and education, it's the view of the Commission that the voluntary systems have to supplement the ability of the state to deliver in these crucial areas. 17. Promotions of academic disciplines related to culture, philosophy, history, and constitutional values. 1. Academic disciplines relating to certain social science and humanities subjects are getting marginalized in school and university education, partly because of non availability of funds and inadequate enrollment of students. This has had an impact not only on education but also on social development and national integration. In multicultural societies, this has serious implications in the long run. As such, central and state governments should impress upon universities the need for incorporating knowledge of history, philosophy, and culture in the interests of promoting social harmony and national integration. 18. Ensuring efficiency and accountability in delivery of public services. 1. Among the many strategies for ensuring efficiency and accountability in the delivery of public services, two are constitutionally mandated. They are empowering citizens and decentralizing administration. Though much ground is covered in these directions, there are many possibilities for greater innovation and experimentation. Another volume of the report has made detailed recommendations on decentralized governance. 2. The need for citizen empowerment is increasingly being acknowledged by legislations like the Right to Information Act, the National Rural Employment Guarantee Act, the Lokayukta Act, etc. However, good governance is a far cry because of the wide prevalence of corruption and the poor administration of criminal justice. Corruption retards economic growth and imposes heavy burden on the poorer sections of the people. States cannot achieve the goals of development and social justice without ensuring corruption free governance. The corruption problem, when found as a human rights issue, can enable the judiciary to enforce certain rights for the citizenry, demand a transparent and accountable system of governance, and help establish a basis to monitor the process. The inclusion of a fundamental right to corruption free delivery of public services will enable citizens to directly challenge cases of corruption as constitutional violations and to seek constitutional remedies. The Commission is inclined to recommend such an approach as the problem has assumed serious proportions warranting drastic remedies. 19. Time bound implementation of directive principles through decentralized governance. Recommendation 1. The effective implementation of all the policies enumerated in the Constitution and declared fundamental in governance within an agreed time frame is another strategy to deliver good governance and ensure human development. There is no effective method to ensure compliance of governments in this regard, and therefore, publicly announced guidelines are required to be developed by the Center in consultation with states. This will demand effective devolution of powers and functions to the local governments as well. Coupled with social audit of implementation of guidelines through an appropriate mechanism, decentralized system of governance can bring about the reform needed for effective delivery of essential public services. 20. Public private partnership in delivery of public services. Recommendation 1. Private participation in public administration is being increasingly solicited in a variety of fields like education, health, etc., for a variety of reasons. However, an appropriate regulatory framework to ensure standards and accountability in the delivery of public services is still not available. The extension of the concept of state to private entities is not always a viable option though it's being used by courts to extract accountability. The Commission would recommend an institutional design to be developed, keeping in view the demands of rule of law, human rights, and good governance. There are stray examples of state initiatives which seem to be delivering results in certain sectors. These are to be collected, studied, and put on the public domain for adoption elsewhere. Recommendation 2: as a corollary to the evolution of best practices in public private partnership in the delivery of public services, it's necessary to adopt national measurement standards on performance. Looking at the way public services are organized in other federal countries, the Commission strongly recommends the model of collaborative federalism, in which there is interdependence but no hierarchy. The process from policy making to performance assessment is more corroborative without any coercion on the units from the federal government. The collaboration extends to non state stakeholders, and through the collective, transparent, rule based decision making processes, public assets and services are managed with maximum efficiency and accountability. The key element in collaborative federalism is non hierarchical, non authoritarian form of decision making involving governmental and non governmental participants working towards a common objective within a legal framework. This Commission would recommend such a model for the promotion of good governance. Recommendation 3: the Commission would recommend a national standards organization for working out the standards for social sectors on the lines of the Bureau of Indian Standards for Manufacturing Sector. Chapter 9: Looking to the Future. Strong center with strong state coexist under collaborative federalism envisaged by the Constitution. 1. It's now well understood that there is no single pure model of federation and that each federal constitution needs to be described by studying the legal text as well as the prevailing political system. Our founding fathers, realizing the imperatives of the times, sought to create a centralized federation, but powerful forces of linguistic and regional identities and development of political forces around these identities, as well as a desire for more participative governance, has led to strong states and the coming into their own of local bodies, both rural and urban, all of whom are attempting to alter the dynamics of power play in the organization and management of governance. The structure of our Constitution has stood the test of time and has provided for a robust legal regime. The political system, too, has shown dynamism, complying with the dictates of the Constitution, but also adapting it to meet the requirements of changing times. Terminological characterization tends to color people's perception regarding the nature of the Constitution. We prefer that the debate moves away from such characterization to the actual working of the Constitution. 2. We have not sought to rearrange the basic systems, legal or political. The legal text of the Constitution, by its very nature, needs to be clear, precise, and unambiguous, so that each tier knows what is expected of it. However, we do believe that the elements of governance cannot be clinically segregated and would sometimes complement, sometimes supplement, and in some cases overlap. The principle of subsidiary can be stated in simple terms, but it requires great skills of accommodation to make it work. Each tier of government must, therefore, strive to achieve synergy through cooperation and understanding. Our stress, therefore, on the constitutional arrangements on center state relations has been on bringing about changes in the institutional arrangements which would nurture a meaningful and constructive dialogue rather than on trying to minimize conflicts by attempting exclusivity in the division of powers, an exercise we deem as futile. The institutional arrangements would provide platforms for exchange of ideas and for synergizing thoughts and action. Our recommendations pertaining to the role and composition of the Rajya Sabha, a strong proactive interstate council, a similar council at the state level with local body membership, empowered group of ministers for specific issues, progressive constitution of interstate river basins with wide membership, statutory authorities for determination of royalty rates for minerals, committees to recommend compensation packages for forest and resource rich states, coordination committees for infrastructure projects, etc., have been made to provide various fora at appropriate levels to strengthen the dialogue process. In this process, if the center has to be strengthened for certain specific purposes, or if the states and local bodies would need to perform certain additional roles, decisions would be taken jointly after appreciation of various viewpoints, but always keeping the objectives of the exercise in mind. 3. The character of the polity has undergone significant changes. There is a growing demand to increase the stakeholder base as social and economic equality, which was to have come soon after political independence, still remains a dream for many. India needs to build an inclusive society where equity and inclusiveness will permeate all manner of activity. Our recommendations provide for a greater role to elements of civil society by enabling them to perform constitutional and statutory roles. For similar considerations, we have recommended that special consideration be accorded to the needs of the disabled and economically and educationally disadvantaged sections of society, especially in local body governance issues. We have called for harmonization of existing laws with the special laws for tribal areas so that customary rights and community enterprise, which characterize the tribal peoples, are not only safeguarded but become vehicles for their advancement. The center, states, and local bodies need to recognize these important forces which significantly influence lives of ordinary people in their communities. In spite of serious attempts made in 60 years of planned development, large numbers of people remain below the poverty line, no matter which parameters are chosen to arrive at the figures. The tribal areas remain neglected and budgetary allocations for them remain unspent. There is a general perception, and not without reason, that sums earmarked for vulnerable sections of society and neglected areas, even in better off states, do not reach the beneficiaries, so much so that a serious call has now been made for direct disbursements of funds to the poor through coupons. The economy is characterized by declining contribution of agriculture in the GDP, increasing unplanned urbanization, and migration of people from the backward areas in search of livelihood. On the other hand, a resurgent nation has demonstrated that it can achieve rates of growth which only a decade ago appeared unattainable, that it has the capacity to harness the latent talent in many cutting-edge technologies, and that it has a reservoir of entrepreneurial talent in many financial, service, and manufacturing sectors. There is a growing realization that the demographic profile of a young population can be made to deliver dividends only if it could be given the necessary skills, education, and imbued with the right attitudes and sensitivities. Our recommendations on time-bound devolution of powers to local bodies, providing the proper emphasis to district and metropolitan planning, giving a distinct role to public private partnerships, especially in infrastructure development, proper understanding of migration issues, redistribution of wealth, and investment in favor of backward areas, focused attention to areas in the Northeast, introduction of GST, and need to usher in a unified market, providing education to all and emphasis on humanities, and which builds a proper attitude towards society, especially towards the disadvantaged, have been made against this background. We have also called for shifts of focus in the functioning of the Finance and Planning Commissions, keeping these considerations in mind. We have also recommended a new approach towards implementing the directive principles, and the success or otherwise of the nation's endeavors will mainly be judged against this yardstick. 5. There are resources, especially natural resources, which each generation nurtures as trustees on behalf of those yet to come. This is national wealth which does not recognize political boundaries, and to preserve and protect our natural resources, a national vision is required. The utilization must be done with great care and caution to achieve optimal benefits, but not at the cost of destruction of the environment and ecology. Keeping this ideal in view, we have made our recommendations on maintenance of the environment and ecology, giving predominance to the Union. However, for proper use of the water and mineral resources and compensatory mechanisms for forest and mineral rich states, we are of the opinion that the center and states must work together. 6. Smoothing functions of center state relations, bringing about social and economic progress, taking care of vulnerable sections of society and backward areas, preserving the environment and ecology, and yet taking care of the livelihood concerns of people are formidable tasks. All cry out for good governance at all three levels. The task has become more difficult as there is growing political mobilization around sectarian and regional interests. The people are disillusioned with the lack of integrity amongst the bureaucracy and growing incidents of waste of public funds, delays, and inefficiency. We have accordingly called for a more consultative structure at all levels, making it mandatory wherever large sums of public money is expended, and on completion of projects, we have stressed upon the need to institute social audits. We have observed that a one policy fit all approach needs to be given up and powers be delegated on the principle of subsidiarity. Vigilance systems in public administration need to be improved. Based on these considerations, we strongly feel that it is time that good governance is given due prominence by including it in Part 4 of the Constitution as a directive principle of state policy. 7. Nations progress within systems where the rule of law prevails and where there is peace and tranquility. Socio-economic progress and good governance provide the firm basis for the prevalence of peace. We have been fortunate that we have well codified laws and an independent and vibrant judiciary to enforce the laws and preserve civil liberties. However, the burden on the justice system is increasing and its weaknesses need to be removed. The policing systems need to be reinvigorated, made accountable and credible in the eyes of the common man. Our recommendations on sharing up the burden of expenditure on courts by the center and measures to bring about reforms in the police are with this objective. However, there are times when the system is put to its severe test. These are when national security is threatened by external aggression or grave internal disturbance. The primary responsibility for preserving life, liberty, and life of the citizens of India is that of the state. Without security, there can be no progress of any kind. The prevailing security scenario is a matter of grave concern. The resolve of the Indian state is being put to a severe test, both by attempts made by outside powers as well as by internal forces, quite often aided and abetted by the outside forces. The nature of terrorism has altered over the years. It has also established links with transnational organized crime involving drug smuggling, human trafficking, the illegal arms trade, extortions, etc. Safe havens in failed and failing states are provided to terrorists. Networks are spread over the entire country with masterminds operating the levers from outside our shores, whereas a clear divide in criminal jurisprudence is required to fix responsibility for prevention, investigation, and prosecution for violations of ordinary laws, and this must be the responsibility of the states which are most proximate to the scenes of crime. Their position changes dramatically when public order is disturbed for prolonged periods and covers large areas or is likely to influence peace and tranquility elsewhere, or where acts of terrorism are perpetrated and proxy wars fought threatening the security of the entire nation itself. In such cases, the nation must come together, putting all its resources to use. Cooperation and synergy are put to their stiffest test. For too long, we have allowed the debate to continue, unable to unambiguously delineate the legal and investigative domain of the center and states to combat terrorism and organized crime, many a time coming close to taking the hard decisions required, but shying away at the last moment. Steps have been taken, but only when spurred by events such as those of November 26, 2008. Knowing this weakness of our system, the enemies of the state have taken advantage and have made deep inroads. It's not enough to hold the ground now. The Indian state must become proactive. Both the center and the states must work together, but the legal regime and investigative authority needs to be set in clear terms. Our recommendations on prevention of communal violence, definitions of interstate and transnational crimes, and methods of tackling them, as well as acts of terror, as also use of Article 355 in limited areas, have been made with this spirit in mind. We should not wait for events to dictate our actions. Rather, by our actions, we need to reorder events for the good of the nation. This is true not only for security, peace, and tranquility, but for all other nation building activities.